This episode is presented by Invest Puerto Rico. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. Hello, and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is June 7th, 2024. I'm Marianne Azevedo, and joining me is Senior TC Reporter on the Transportation Desk, Rebecca Ballon. Rebecca, how are you this week?
I'm doing great, Marianne. Thanks so much.
Happy to have you on, as always. Before we get to the show rundown, I want to ask our listeners, please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever your preferred pod streamer is. We'd really appreciate it. Now let's talk about what we're going to have on the show today. Before we get into our deals of the week, we'll be talking about news that broke yesterday about Robinhood acquiring global crypto exchange Bitstamp. Then we'll talk about two healthcare startups raising money. And then we'll dig into Fisker's collapse and have our transportation reporter, Sean O'Kane, give us all the details of his months-long investigation into what went on there. Finally, we'll get into the next generation of fintech. Lots happening as always, some good, some not so good. And on that fintech note, as mentioned, news broke yesterday that Robinhood acquired Bitstamp for $200 million, or is going to acquire Bitstamp. This was a surprise, and yet it wasn't. Robinhood has been dabbling around in the crypto space for a while. It's been acquiring different companies left and right. I don't think anyone quite expected this, though. They're paying $200 million in cash for this company, which is European. And it just shows that the company is really serious about crypto and its future and its potential. Rebecca, what did you think? Were you surprised by this?
I was not surprised by this. I think that Robinhood will only continue to embrace cryptocurrency, even though I think that it's had some restrictions with Bitcoin in the past due to regulatory scrutiny in the US. But one thing that I thought was interesting about this was, as you said, this is a European company. So I think it also signals that Robinhood is pushing not just further into crypto, but also just into international markets.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It launched its core stock trading product in the UK last November. It started offering crypto trading in the EU shortly after that. So, yeah, I mean, I think Robinhood, talking about ups and downs like we were earlier, Robinhood has had its ups and downs, right? It went public in mid-2021. Things were kind of like going great. Its IPO valuation was around 32 billion, got up to like more than 40 billion. It's kind of down now to about 19 billion. Which still isn't bad. It had record...
Yeah, so far down.
Yeah, so far down. Only $19 billion. But it did have record earnings. I think it was in the first quarter. So, I mean, it's not doing too bad. I think a lot of the interest revenue has helped over the past year or so. The deal, I think, is expected to close, let's see, in the first half of 2025. So will be interesting to see what happens as Robinhood integrates it into its offering.
What does Bitstamp bring to the table exactly?
Let's see. It's it's been around for a while, right? It's founded in 2011. It's one of the world's oldest cryptocurrency exchanges, which I did not know, and allows companies, individuals to trade in all manner of cryptocurrency. It was actually acquired by a Belgian investment company in 2018. Ripple bought a stake last year. So I think it's just going to really help Robinhood grow its crypto business generally. They said in a statement that the team has established one of the strongest reputations across retail and institutional crypto investors. So the company will be better positioned to expand its footprint outside of the US and welcome institutional customers to Robinhood.
Yeah, I like the kind of blending of making it easy to invest in just normal stocks and then also kind of decentralized markets as well.
Yeah, definitely. So let's move on to our deals of the week. We both picked healthcare related deals, which I think is great. We do have a new venture reporter, Marina Temkin, on board, who's been with us a few months now, who's looking more closely at the health tech space. And there's a lot happening there. Rebecca, tell us about Sword Health.
Yeah, so Sword Health has just raised in total $130 million, and its valuation has soared to $3 billion as a result of that. I like this story for two reasons. So the first is that Sword Health is an interesting product, right? It's an AI-powered virtual physical therapy startup. And I think that's really cool because physical therapy is... I've been trying to get an appointment with a physical therapist for weeks, and I'm often too busy. Their hours don't work for me. It's really expensive. So I think something like this could really democratize access to physical therapy. And I think that they're using the funds to, beef up the AI as expected, introduce a human-like voice for its Gen AI named Phoenix to its musculoskeletal therapy, and also help with women's pelvic healthcare therapy, which is so important. And I want to see more startups doing this. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Clients include employers and health plans of Fortune 500 companies. That's cool. Now, what I think is really interesting about this, aside from the product, is how they raise this money. So like I said, it's $130 million in total, but that's $30 million in equity. And then they let their employees sell $100 million worth of equity to new and existing investors, including Khosla Ventures. So they had actually initially planned to only do $100 million in a secondary round, but the company decided at the end of the day to then raise the $30 million primary round to update its valuation after seeing the secondary round was oversubscribed. So the reason I think that's interesting is because secondaries, well, they don't exactly give the company that $100 million to play with, right? But it does help them, one, with a better valuation. Two, it's a way to attract institutional investors who'd rather buy big stakes from existing shareholders rather than dealing with the complications of primary equity financing. It could signal that Sword Health is prepping for an IPO. The founder and CEO, Virgilio Bento, said they don't need the influx of capital because they're expecting to be profitable by end of year. And so that $30 million will just sit in the bank and collect interest. But yeah, I just think it's an interesting financial instrument to use. And I think, Marian, you were telling me earlier that another company has done this as well, right?
Yeah, Rippling, HR tech company, recently also closed a similar round. I think I'm trying to remember the exact details. It was $200 million raised a new capital, but another $670 million worth of shares being sold by existing stockholders. So this, I don't want to say this is a trend, but I can see that companies that seem to be doing pretty well, like these two, are seeing this as an opportunity to give some of these existing shareholders some liquidity, raise capital. You're right. It's an interesting strategy. Sword Health is in a unique position, I think, in the startup world today to be able to do this, to just raise the extra $30 million to have it sit in the bank. And they said like you said, they mainly wanted to be able to increase their valuation in a competitive environment too. I think it was a signal that they wanted to send out publicly. They compete heavily with Hinge Health, which is also a multi-billion-dollar company. So there's a lot of interesting aspects to this deal, and agreed with you too that the actual technology is pretty fascinating as well.
Yeah, so I think Sword Health was founded to treat musculoskeletal conditions that range from a sprained ankle to a disc compression. So its platform will connect consumers to a virtual physical therapist. Consumers get a tablet and then motion sensors, so they can kind of go through the motions literally and then get feedback and tips through this digital therapist. So yeah, interesting tech, interesting way to raise money. And, healthcare is just booming right now, I guess, as we all continue to sit at our desks and hurt our backs, right?
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, healthcare is something that's always going to be needed because, hey, we're all going to get older, we're all going to age, and we're all going to probably, unfortunately, eventually have some health problems as we age. So yes, to your point, healthcare space is kind of hot right now. My deal of the week is a company called Echo Health. They just raised $41 million. And I loved this company. What they've built is an AI enhanced stethoscope. And they've sold more than 500 of these to physicians and healthcare providers. So this is fascinating to me. What this stethoscope does, and talk about really cool applications of AI, is it can actually help detect heart conditions. So, with a normal stethoscope, there's only so much a doctor can hear, right? And there's only so much that they can detect. But with their stethoscope, because they've amassed this large data set of chest sounds and ECG information, which ECG stands for electrocardiogram, for those who don't know, they've developed these algorithms to detect certain heart conditions like murmurs, even like the beginnings of heart disease, which is fascinating. And one of the things also they're trying to do, they can also detect the first signs of heart failure during a routine exam, is one of the things that they claim. Yeah. And in April, they got FDA clearance for using its AI to help detect the first signs of heart failure, which is incredible. So yeah, it was cleared to detect heart murmurs, which could be a sign of abnormal heart valves. And also what they're trying to do next, I think, is develop some AI algorithms to detect pulmonary conditions such as asthma and pneumonia.
That's so cool. I love that.
Isn't that incredible? So I've had, not to get too deep into personal experiences, I've had family members with a lot of health problems over the years. And in one case, someone very close to me had pneumonia, was not detected by his doctor in the office, and he got very, very sick as a result. And I'm thinking, well, how can you go to a doctor, have them check your lungs? They tell you everything's fine, sounds okay, send you home. 2 days later, you end up in the ER, find out that you have pneumonia so bad that they tell you that, if you go home, you could die. Like, I don't get that. So when I read about things like this, it's like, wow, I mean, how many lives could be saved by this technology? Heart disease as well. I mean, or heart failure, how many people are probably suffering from heart failure and have absolutely no clue? Because how do you know what you don't know? You don't know, okay, maybe I need to go get an ultrasound or ECG or whatever the case may be. How do you know to do that? So if that can be detected during a routine medical exam, again, think about all the lives that could be saved.
Well, not just lives, but also time. Like, I actually recently had to go get an ECG and do a stress test. And first of all, these things take like a lot of time. And to get an appointment, it takes weeks to get an appointment with your doctor. Like, people are on these waiting lists for ages. If you could just do all of that during the routine exam, I mean, that just cuts out so much time and hassle, and the need maybe for someone to have to, get hooked up to a bunch of wires and sprint on a treadmill in a small doctor's office. It's a very strange experience. But by the way, I also want to note that you said that more than 500 of these have been sold. It was more than 500,000, I think is what you meant to say. These things are
did I
flying
say 500?
off the shelves.
I meant 500,000, which is a huge difference. Thank you for catching that.
No, it's fine. I mean, like, look, all the zeros that we see so many zeros in our line of work that it's,
Thanks for pointing that out. And speaking of numbers, I don't know if I mentioned that the company just raised a $41 million Series D round.
Wow.
We don't know its valuation, but still a pretty significant size in this environment. So kudos to both these companies. Love to see it. Hope we see more of it. Next, we're going to have a break, and then we'll talk to our transportation reporter, Sean O'Kane, about Fisker and some drama in fintech. What's next in tech? That's not the right question. It's where. Puerto Rico, where an entrepreneurial ecosystem pulses with connectivity, capability, and possibility, where the most competitive tax incentives in the U.S. fast-track success, and hard work is rewarded with sunsets and turquoise waters. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. investpr.org/TechCrunch. And we're back with our first theme today. I'm so excited to say that we have our transportation reporter extraordinaire, Sean O'Kane, on the show with us to talk about his months-long investigative story into EV startup Fisker. Wow, talk about drama. Sean, first of all, how many months exactly did you work on this story?
Good question, and also happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I would say, in earnest, I was really working on this version of this story for a couple of weeks to maybe a month or two. But some of the stuff that's in it are things that I've been talking to people about for many, many, many more months, like dating back to, around the time some of these things happen. Some of the stuff in the story takes place in like June of last year. And it wasn't long after that I started hearing about some of these things. And it was really just it's been a months-long process of just trying to corroborate as much of that as possible to make sure that we get it right.
Well, fill our listeners in for those who haven't read this incredible story. What exactly happened at Fisker? I mean, I have to say, first of all, when I read your articles and I looked at the photos and I was like, wow, that's actually a really pretty car, a really beautiful vehicle. And then I would read your stories and I was like, oh my gosh, but they're just a mess inside the company and the cars. So fill the listeners in. What happened there?
Sure. That's a great way into it, because for people who are unfamiliar with the company, it's a company that was started by a relatively well-known vehicle designer named Henrik Fisker, who has designed cars for BMW. He's had a long career. He even had a startup back in sort of the first clean tech boom around the time of the recession, where he was trying to make a hybrid sports car at the time. This is his second go at coming up with a startup like this. This time it's all electric. And yeah, this vehicle, the Ocean SUV, launched in 2022, or it started getting built in 2022. The whole idea of this version of the company is essentially He wanted to take an asset light approach, outsource pretty much as possible, have a tier one supplier build the car. That's really stands in contrast to a lot of these other startups in the space like Rivian or Lucid Motors, who are basically trying to do it all themselves, still supplying things from suppliers in the automotive world, but trying to build the factories, trying to do pretty much everything that Tesla does. And so, a lot of attention has been put on the design of the car. It's a pretty sharp looking SUV. It's still an SUV. It's nothing radical, but there are some nice touches to it and it looks pretty good. But, as I get into in the story, the problem at this company that you can sort of apply to all the other things that have gone wrong with it so far is there's just not really been any process in place. The sort of proper processes and procedures that companies tend to take when building a car company from scratch, a lot of those weren't here. They, maybe sort of cavalierly believed that they could get away with not doing some of these things because they were a startup and they were trying to embrace the chaos. But this is a very heavily regulated industry. It's a very heavily regulated product.
As it should be.
To not take that approach, as it should be. Yeah, people's lives are literally on the line. And so they just did not go down that path. And the story really gets into a couple clear examples where that sort of metastasized. This one in particular where in the run up to releasing the car, the first of these SUVs were shipped last June in the US. And in the run up to that, all of a sudden, after the design had been sort of set out and they were already working to build the cars with the supplier in Austria, Henrik Fisker decided, I want to have wheel spacers put on these cars. And wheel spacers are these just sort of inserts that go in between the wheel and the wheel hub. And they really are just a cosmetic type thing where, it pushes the wheel out a little bit, maybe makes the car look a little meaner. It's really a design thing. And it's unsurprising that it came from him. But to do something that late in the game with a car, when usually car companies have these designs locked years ahead of time before they do anything like that, it's really kind of unheard of. And it set off this kind of reaction inside the company of just sort of like, what is going on? Like, this goes well beyond the natural tension between the design side and the engineering side. With hardware startups, that's always in tension. But here it was just sort of like, this is going really far. And in the story, we get into how, there were people on the engineering team who really pushed back. They weren't saying, let's not do this. They were saying, let's find the right way forward to do it. And that was just never really embraced from what I've been told. And so the rest of the story gets into a lot of other examples like that, where it's just like the company felt it didn't need to build out a large stockpile of spare parts, which most companies do. And then all of a sudden they started having trouble with the cars when they started getting on the road in big numbers. And now they didn't have any spare parts. So they started pinching parts from the production line in Austria. They started taking apart some of the marketing cars they had. They even harvested parts from Henrik's own car.
That's crazy.
And I will say real quick, and then you can ask me anything else. Fisker has denied some of those things on the record to us. They have told us they didn't pinch parts. They didn't take cars apart to put parts in customer cars. But it's just not true. I don't know why they're denying that so forcefully, but it's not true. We're not the only one to report some of this stuff, but we have, I think, the most detail on it. And from everybody I've spoken to, it's just, this is what they had to do inside to try to keep the company moving forward. And now they're at a position where they've stopped production of the car. They're basically on the brink of bankruptcy, and it's hard to see sort of a way out for them.
One of the lines that I pulled out of your story that I was like, I almost screamed when I read it, and I just want to read it to our audience, is: the bolts on the Ocean's hood had a tendency to come loose, which led to some flying up and cracking the windshield and doing damage to the body. I was like, what are they saying?
Yeah.
And not only are these cars, potentially dangerous and falling apart, but also apparently, as you reported, Fisker was cutting corners on customer service. Instead of having like live humans, they were wanting chatbots or something. But it's like, with so many problems, like you would think that customer service would be a real differentiator for that kind of a company. We've seen from Tesla having, also not great customer service. I mean, their cars function way better, but this is kind of a thing that really bothers people across industries, is not being able to talk to someone who can help them fix their problems. And when that is a multi-$1,000, very expensive luxury vehicle, it's pretty Yeah.
I mean, Sean, yeah, I would just follow up on that point. Another thing you had written was that customers, like they had dying cars, faulty brakes, stuck doors. They were waiting weeks or months for repairs. And then the company was getting sued left and right. Those lemon lawsuits. I just find it horrifying that there are people that operate with such hubris to think that they can make cars in such a faulty manner. And how do you sleep at night? Like, how do you sleep at night knowing that you're making money or trying to make money by selling people these vehicles that are so shoddy? It actually infuriates me.
Yeah, it's, I think the thing I keep coming back to is you look at the history that Henry Fisker's had with that first startup that I mentioned. There were a lot of things that went wrong that doomed that startup, because that startup ended up going into bankruptcy after he left as CEO, but it wound up failing in that way. But, to me, this whole time that I've been reporting on them, I just keep coming back to this idea of like, one of the things that actually really did that company in, among other things, was that they got into production, they got that car on the road, and then they weren't really ready to handle this sort of myriad problems that happen just to every car company, no matter how good your car is. And you have to be ready to handle all these edge cases because driving is insane. People drive a lot. So there's just more and more, the more cars that get on the road, more people use them, the more time you have for them to get into trouble with them. And, to me, I keep coming back to this idea of like, if there was one lesson you would imagine someone like him would have learned from the failure of that startup, it's to be absolutely as ready as possible to handle the customer service, to handle all of this, it's called in the industry after sales, all of this stuff, building out customer service team, having a stockpile of service parts, having reliable partners who can help fix the car, and just so much of that wasn't there. And that wasn't for lack of trying on the employee side. I mean, I've spoken to employees who, there was one in a story that I wrote in February for us, where a customer told me he was trying to get help and had so much trouble getting in touch with the company to get customer service. He wound up talking to one of these people who had helped work on his car, and they were picking up on their personal cell phone at a funeral. Like all these employees were putting in so much time and effort, and also, again, trying to tell the leadership, hey, like there's ways to get through this. And employees tell me there's this feeling of a lack of trust in the people that were hired there amongst the leadership. It's like they didn't want to rely on the experience that these people had for whatever reason. And so this is where we're at, and there's been so many scary instances with some of these problems. Some of these cars have died on the highway at high speeds. The hoods popping up was a relatively limited thing, probably in the dozen or so range, maybe a little bit more, but still part of me is at least sort of thankful that they were only able to ship around 7,000 of these things so far, because I think if they had been able to hit the targets they were promising, which originally was supposed to be 40,000 cars last year, there would just be so many more problems on the road given the quality of the cars that we've seen so far. And so, I think to an extent, they're only still around because they were only able to ship around 7,000 cars. Because if they had gone any further than that, the problems I think would have overwhelmed them by now.
One of the things I loved about this article, or like the main thing I loved about it and how deep you went into it, is it's just a reminder that companies are not just these like corporate entities. They're made up of many humans who have conflicting ideas, who make mistakes, who get into arguments and have these, differences of opinion. And that has real consequences. And it's just, the drama is tea. And it's like, I guess this is why Succession was so successful, right? You're looking, really looking under the hood, right? To make a bad pun. It's such a great read. I encourage our readers to take a look at it.
Really is,
Thank
Sean. You do amazing work. Thank you so much for joining us today. And yes, to our listeners, if you haven't yet read it, look it up. The article is an excellent read. Well, we're going to let Sean get back to work, but even though he's leaving, we're going to talk about another one of his investigative stories. This one he worked on with Dominique Midori Davis, and it involved a company called LoanSnap. And talk about drama. This is an AI mortgage startup that's being sued left and right from creditors. I think there's about 7 or so lawsuits against it right now. It's been evicted from its headquarters in Southern California. And what is most astounding about all this is, despite all that, this company has managed to raise about $100 million in funding and debt in the past few years, $90 million of which was secured between 2021 and 2023, while it was having a lot of these problems. So this just makes me wonder, like, did investors do any due diligence? I mean, what the heck happened here? I mean, Rebecca, what did you think when you read about this?
Well, one of the backers is this the lead singer of Chainsmokers? What's going on? Chainsmokers Mantis Ventures?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they're venture
Not to cast
firm.
aspersions. Maybe they're really good at doing their due diligence. But yeah, it's pretty intense. And I think that the company is not yet shut down, but employees are understandably very concerned. I think they used to, at their high point, they had employed more than 100 people. And then after layoffs and attrition, that number is less than 50, according to a source that spoke to TechCrunch. I wonder if there's like a case for fraud at this stage, considering mismanagement of funds potentially.
Yeah, I mean, the entities, the 7 different creditors that have sued the company or are suing the company, collectively allege that the startup owes them more than $2 million. It's also been fined by state and federal agencies and nearly lost its license to operate in Connecticut. Ouch.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot going on there. And, we're not really sure what happened. I know that a lot of mortgage companies got hit really hard in 2022, I guess, when interest rates started rising. So that's my guess, is maybe the company was doing pretty well when interest rates were super low. I mean, during the pandemic, like we refinanced our home for like 2.5%. And then, they surged to like 8%. I think it got up to like 8% last year. So I don't know. My guess is maybe the company ran into some troubles there. According to the story, in 2021, LoanSnap originated nearly 1,300 loans for a total value of almost $500 million. But by 2023, the company reported to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that it had originated only 122 loans for the year.
Wow. I'm reading from Sean and Dominic that people who spoke to TechCrunch say that, they're kind of, as usual, kind of blaming the current state that it's in on, quote, terrible leadership, overspending on futility, and institutional investors falling for the charming facade that Carl can show. And Carl is the founder, Carl Jacob.
Yeah, I mean, it's happened so many times more than we can count, right? Adam Newman is an example where investors get, caught up in the charisma of a founder and just sort of blindly keep backing them. Yeah, I mean, since 2021, there's been several complaints filed against the company with the Better Business Bureau, which now has an F rating on there about that.
Ouch.
So, yeah. So allegations of charging non-refundable fees, failing to close on loans in a timely manner, failing to pay taxes from an escrow account. Boy, I'd be livid if that were me. So anyway, lots going on there. Kudos once again to Sean for his investigative reporting, and Dom as well, who pitched in. We will have to wait and see what happens at LoanSnap. But hey, not everything is bad in fintech. I wrote about a couple of very interesting startups in the past couple of weeks that are focused on the Gen Z market. And this was really interesting to me, I think, because there were a lot of similarities between the two companies, although they do different things. One of them is called Fritch. And Rebecca, I'll let you share what that stands for.
Stands for effing rich.
That's right.
Effing rich. Okay, let's keep it PG, people.
Thank you. Yeah, Fritch and then Fizz. So Fritch was founded by 2 young ladies who met while they were at NYU Abu Dhabi. And one of them was a former model, teen model. She became financially independent at a young age. And then the other, she just also said she had to learn to manage money early on. And they kind of bonded because they were like, wow, I mean, it's not easy to learn how to manage money. We don't have a lot of resources to do that. Why don't we create something to help our generation? So they founded this company called Fritch, and they say it wants to be kind of a social financial community for the Gen Z population. They said that, right now with social media, there's a lot of people who are like touting things like on TikTok or Instagram about, oh, I make money doing this. I make so much money doing that, and making it seem like they live these lavish lifestyles. And they're like, this is just not always realistic. They're setting examples that aren't necessarily authentic for people. We want to help Gen Zers like truly understand how they compare to their peers financially. So users of Fritch can get on the app. They can ask questions anonymously. They can see what others with similar backgrounds spend on entertainment, investing, and rent. They can ask questions like, how much are people my age investing? Do my classmates have allowances? Stuff like that. So the company has raised $2.8 million in a seed funding round led by Restive Ventures and looking to grow. They said they have over 100,000 users so far nationwide.
I have a couple of questions. One of them is, okay, Gen Z users nationwide. Is this like, are Gen Zs looking for, I sound so old, are Gen Z looking for help with their finances because they are increasingly pursuing kind of non-traditional roles that allow them to, make money off their TikToks. That's one question. And then the other question is, what is the business model exactly for Fritch? Like how are they making money?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So at first they started like by advertising, but now they partner with a lot of brands that they use to kind of help educate their users on things. So that's how they're making money, kind of actually a SaaS model where they charge like a subscription. And as for demand, I think this generation, that's a good point. They're making money in different ways, right? A lot of them are doing things independently or as creators. And also just in general, they might be like credit card averse too. And they're already starting to think at a young age, how can I save? How can I be financially independent? And so as one of the co-founders said, they want to like be able to understand how others their age are doing and how they're doing it. So so Fritch, they team up with these financial brands, which they connect to these users to say like, hey, these are brands that can help you or do things, like I said. And that's how they make money through this B2B subscription model.
So will they like link you to, Robinhood or something?
Or
and
like
be
a credit builder.
Okay.
Like a credit builder. Here's a credit builder that can help you build your credit.
Right.
Things like that.
And does it teach them how to invest and things like that as well?
Yeah, all sorts of different brands. And so then they charge the brands and those companies a fee.
I'm interested to see how this works out. And there's another one, right? It's another Gen Z fintech.
Yeah. So I also wrote about Fizz. And so it was started by two young men. And this company to me also was very interesting. There's a lot of unique things about its model. So first of all, the two founders, they dropped out of Harvard and Cornell. And they were ages 19 and 21 when they decided to do this, to start this company, which like, wow, okay. I'm going to say something. If I were a parent and my kid had gotten into one of these schools and decided to drop out to found a startup, I'm going to have to admit, I'd be supportive, but I'd be a little bit like seething inside too, because I mean, wow, you get your kid gets accepted, you're paying all this money for them to go to these schools, and they're like, all right, I don't want to do this anymore. But okay, now forget the parenting hat. In general, I do admire, I admire the fact that they took this risk, they took these chances. Good for them. So far, it seems to be paying off. So they built what they called Fizz. It started out as this debit card for the younger generation, but they really wanted to make it so much more than that. They wanted it to be a card that helps them learn how to build credit. And so they incorporated into it an artificial intelligence-based budgeting product. And then they offered gamified financial literacy courses as well, so that these people, also their target demographic is college students, a fun and interactive way to learn. So a few other interesting things about this company, they decided to build their own infrastructure from scratch instead of like what they describe becoming a patchwork quilt of fintech SaaS vendors, which, hey, also good for them. They said they spent about 2 years building this infrastructure. And also they decided they didn't want to partner with like a BaaS provider, banking as a service provider. They went to build their own banking relationship directly with the lead bank. Considering what's been going on in BaaS, I think that seemed like not such a bad move. And now they've raised $14.4 million in seed funding, which was led by Kleiner Perkins. They'd gone through the Y Combinator summer 2021 cohort. YC also invested in its seed round. So they seem to be growing quite a bit. They are available to students at over 300 campuses in the US right now.
Would this make them a neobank? Could they fall under that category?
That's a good question. I wouldn't call them necessarily a neobank just yet, although they do offer this debit card. But that's a good question, because I don't think they offer a lot of the other services that traditionally neobanks do, like savings or, other things that are associated with just like traditional banks, for example, beyond the debit card. But Fizz is definitely, its aim is to help these users learn how to build their credit. But I think the good news with them is they have partnered directly with this bank. It's called Lead Bank. So I think they're taking very seriously, the matters of compliance, and they're not just like letting someone else handle that. Like I said, not saying, okay, here's to a BaaS provider. You take the money and you make sure it gets to where, somewhere safe. They have ownership of that in that direct relationship with the bank. So I feel like that's where they've addressed that part of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense.
Yeah. And so I applaud these young people. I admire all of them for just taking these chances. And they're all, it's kind of refreshing having covered fintech for a while, talking to these people who really just are earnest, right? They seem like they have such passion for what they're doing. And I love it. I love it very much. I think it's awesome. And Kleiner Perkins' partner, Ilya Fishman, who joined Fiz's board as part of the financing, he said that, this is a really crucial time. And, this is when a lot of people get their first credit cards on when they're in college and then start becoming financially independent. So instead of offering, because I remember when I was in college, I think my first car was a Discover. So a lot of these traditional credit cards have hidden fees, high interest rates. Fiz is saying, no, we're going to offer you a credit line based on your spending patterns. And we're not requiring credit checks or security deposits, things like that. So they really want to just kind of make it easier for these younger people to become financially independent without getting in over their heads in debt.
Do we know how many people they have signed up so far?
Yeah, they said tens of thousands of users so far.
Wow. And it's for Gen Z, right? Can anyone sign up? There's plenty of people who aren't financially literate, who aren't in that age bracket.
Yeah, I'm sure they're not going to turn away anybody who doesn't necessarily fall into this bracket, but that is their target demographic. But I think if someone who's not Gen Z said, I really, want to use this card, I doubt they'd say no.
Yeah, I certainly hope not.
I would hope not. But on that note, we're going to have to end the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Equity will be back on Monday. Until then, you can find me on X at Bay Area Writer and Equity under the handle Equity Pod on X and Threads. Don't forget to check out our sister show Found, which dives deep into the stories behind startups with the founders who built them. Thank you again for joining us, Rebecca. It was a blast. Hope everyone has a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye.
Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavett, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.